In u7d1, I'm going to talk about the rule of thirds, and if you'll indulge me, I'm going to have some fun with this one because we really need to take a moment to talk about the rule of thirds. It's the most misunderstood thing of first-time video production students, and it's so easy to get right, and it makes such a difference. If you follow the rule of thirds when you shoot video, your videos will immediately look more professional, more polished than anyone else's, and here's how to do that. First of all, some definitions. In the rule of thirds, we're going to divide the screen into thirds. We're going to divide it both horizontally and vertically into thirds. And as a result, the screen is going to look like a tic-tac-toe board. There are going to, on various cameras, you can turn on the rule of thirds. Some cameras refer to this as a grid. As you're hunting through the menu, make sure to find a way to turn on the grid, or sometimes called an overlay. So hunt through the camera's menu to make sure you turn on this feature of the camera. The camera will help you shoot in the rule of thirds. So what is that going to mean? Well, here is a screen. This is a 16:9 aspect ratio because it's a modern HD screen, and here comes our first third line and our second. There's the two horizontal lines of thirds. And here comes our vertical lines, vertical there and vertical there. And now we have a tic-tac-toe board, or a grid, dividing it into 9 even squares. So there is what the rule of thirds looks like. Let's talk about the next thing, which is intersection points. All right. There are 4 spots on this rule of thirds where the lines intersect each other. Those are the 4 golden zones, the 4 hot spots, and these are what you're going to learn to look for when you're shooting video. Anywhere these lines cross each other is the place where you want to put your subject. So putting the subject of the shot on one of those 4 zones will make your shot just look much better, look more polished. Never put your subject in the center of a shot. That's what all people do the very first time they pick up a camera, is they aim the center of their shot at their subject. We're not going to do that in this class, and I'm going to teach you how to avoid it. So let's bring in that rule of thirds grid. There it is. And there's one of those intersecting points. There's the second one. There's the third. And there's the fourth. These are the 4 places to put your video subject. The subject goes on one of those 4 spots, and never in the center. Don't put your subject in that center and you will be golden. But why, you ask? What's the purpose of this rule? Where did it come from? Well, that's a long story, and you'd want to take an art history class to really explore that story. It goes back to the Renaissance painters who figured this rule out. But basically, to summarize, thirds are just pleasing to the eye. The human eye is drawn to things that are divided into thirds rather than halves. Not sure exactly why on that one. Another good reason is it doesn't trap the viewer's eye in the center. Turns out that if we look at something in the center of an image, then our eye doesn't move through the image. It gets stuck on the center. So that's why we don't want anything in the center. Once we're drawing someone's eye through the image, then we are engaging them. We are helping them become an active viewer rather than a passive viewer, and inviting them to spend more time looking at our image by moving our eyes through the image. How's that going to look? Well, let's talk about eyes first of all. When you're shooting a human subject, their eyes go on an intersecting line. The eyes always an intersecting line. Here's a grid with the 4 intersecting points marked, and here comes a human subject, and we have put that person's eyes on that intersection point right there. So where this line and this line cross, that's where we want this person's eyes. That's a medium close-up, by the way, head and shoulders. Another application, if your subject is, put the subject of the shot on intersection points. We've already covered that. Here is a nice grid for us. If your subject is a blue triangle and you're asking yourself, how should I point the camera at that blue triangle? Then here's your answer. Put that blue triangle there on that intersecting point, or there on that one, or you can probably guess the rest, there or there. Those are the 4 hot spots, the 4 golden spots to put your subject, but never, ever put your subject in the center. What would that look like? Well, here's our grid, and here comes a subject flying into the center. Let's look at that. Your eyes are drawn to that subject, and then they get trapped there. Boom, in a bullseye. Your eyes don't wander around the image. They don't get distracted by anything else. It's a dead zone, and so we don't do it. Don't put your subject in the center of the shot. All right, so now that you know a little bit about composition, it's a good time to point out there are a lot more rules to composition. Composition itself is an art form in video production, in film production, but in Video 1a, that's all we're going to cover it right now. There's much more to come in advanced video classes. But let's look at a couple of examples of using the rule of thirds well. So here's a nice shot of a dog. And you can see that I have got that dog nicely composed on the rule of thirds. His eye is right there at that intersection point. I did a pretty good job of nailing that. You don't have to be all that specific with it. It's not a rule you have to slavishly follow. His eye isn't exactly on the intersection point, but it's pretty darn close. And anywhere within this zone would be just fine. And notice he's taking up about 2/3 of the screen. Notice also the ground is taking up 1/3 and the background is about 2/3. So we're using thirds a couple of different ways. That grid line is helping us divide this into thirds to make this shot more pleasing to the eye. And there is the same shot without using the rule of thirds. And you can see this one is boring, it's dull, it's ugly. There's the grid line, and we can see that we have put his eyes right in the center of that grid line. And therefore, you, the viewer, get your eyes trapped by it. You don't believe me? Well, look at them side by side. Watch these two videos for a moment, take some time to just go back and forth between them and see that the one on the bottom is clearly a better shot. Don't get distracted by the fact that this one's sort of gray and this one's sort of black. Other than that, this one is just a better composed shot, though the lighting is maybe a little bit more interesting in this one. All right, moving on with more examples. Here is a bad example. That shot is too centered. So we can see, bring in our grid line, that this interesting line through the rocks is a very interesting line, but by putting that line in the center, it creates a boring composition that traps our eye. How would we fix that? Well, just move the camera a little bit. Now that more interesting line is over here to the left. That creates about 2/3 of the image being this rock, about 1/3 that rock. It's more dynamic. Your eye moves up here and can wander around and look at these interesting shapes. Your eye gets pulled away and distracted, and then your eye can follow and back over to this line. And we can come over here and circle around this one. Much more dynamic, interesting composition that engages the viewer. Another bad example. In this shot, I was walking through the woods and saw some interesting woods, and I saw an interesting rock. But you can't tell what the subject is of this picture. Is this a picture of a woods with a rock in it, or is this a picture of a rock with some woods behind it? You can't tell because it's cut directly in half. The line of the rock goes right down the middle, and that leaves the viewer confused about what it is we're supposed to be noticing here, woods or rock. How do we fix it? Well, as you can imagine, we simply move the camera. So by panning a little bit to the right, I got a lot more of the rock in the picture, and now it's clear this is a picture of a rock with some woods in the background. I even managed to get that little leaf right there to be, you guessed it, right at an intersection point. That again is going to reinforce the dynamic composition of this, where our eyes can move around and all that. And notice the rock does go well beyond the 2/3 line. The reason I did that in this case is because the rock starts to go out of focus right about there, and so the focused part of the rock is about 2/3, and I thought that the background of the rock, it just kind of blends into the woods anyway, so that's why I composed that to be 2/3 like that. I think I've got one more example for you. Yeah. Okay. This is another interesting line between a rock, and I thought it was cool the way the edge of this rock was split and that little circle was right there. But as you can see, I centered that. And that means it's confusing to the viewer. What is it we're supposed to be looking at? Is it the trees or is it the rock? And also, once our eyes find that nice spot, we get stuck there. We can't move around dynamically in this image because we don't know where to go. Watch what happens if we simply reshoot that, but this time pulling that interest spot up to this crosshair, that intersection point in the rule of thirds. Now my eyes can follow that tree, my eyes can come down that tree, my eyes can drift along this rock over to this line and come right back up. It's a dynamic composition. You can sit there and spend some time looking at it because when we pull in our grid, we're using the intersecting points, we're using the lines of thirds. In fact, this diagonal right here, 2/3 of the rock, 2/3 of the picture rather, is rock, 1/3 is trees. It's a more dynamic, engaging composition. That's a lot on the rule of thirds, I know, and you'll need a lot of time to practice it. But in general, you got your 4 intersecting points, put your subject there. Just don't put your subject in the middle. Keep people's eyes at the lines of the third lines, and you're going to be okay.